This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. For our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Matt Erickson. Hello, welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Matt Erickson. Matt is a pastor, writer, speaker, and disciple of Jesus. Since 2010, Matt has served as the senior pastor at Eastbrook Church, an urban multiracial church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Matt received a Bachelor of Arts degree in English and Christian Education from Wheaton College, a Master of Divinity degree from Northern Theological Seminary, and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Western Theological Seminary in connection with the Eugene Peterson Center for Christian Imagination. He is the author of the recently published book, The Pastor is Gardener, A Renewed Vision for Ministry. Matt is married to Kelly, who has served in various ministry roles and operates her own spiritual direction practice. Matt and Kelly are parents of 3 children, all in college or beyond. So thanks for joining me today, Matt. Excited to talk about your book.
Great to be with you, Andrew. It's a huge honor. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. And like we were talking before we started recording, you know, when I saw that your book was heavily influenced by Norman Wirzba, Eugene Peterson, Wendell Berry, and all the rest of the people, I was like, okay, we got to talk because I think there's some kindred spirits, you know, as we read a lot of the same people.
I love it. Yeah, no, I got that sense when we exchanged emails, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, jumping into some of that territory.
Yeah. So your book is about the pastor's gardener. And so, but you write as one who loves gardening. And so I'm curious as we begin, like, what's the origin story? Where did the love of garden come from to the degree so you want to write a book about this metaphor?
Yeah. I mean, from the kind of real life side of it, my wife, Kelly, and I have been gardeners for a really, really long time. And then it also goes back into both of our families. Kelly's dad was a big gardener in their family life when she grew up outside of Detroit, Michigan. And then her dad was from Oregon. So that was just a big part of his family. And then the same with my dad, who grew up more in central Illinois. And the son and grandson of Scandinavian immigrants. My great-grandparents were tenant farmers in central Illinois. And so that's just always been kind of in our environment as a family. I grew up helping my dad and mom with my older brother in garden plots that we rented different places as well as our own yards. And then, just a couple weekends ago, Kelly and I were getting our raised bed gardens all ready. I just added a couple new ones in our yard to be able to get ready for our planting and harvesting, hopefully, as the summer and fall goes along. So that's just a big part of our life and connectivity. And then growing up in the Midwest, obviously, people know there's a lot of farmland around. And I grew up in an area that was where John Deere's international headquarters was. So that was just kind of the atmosphere, even though I grew up in a city.
And so being in Milwaukee, I'm guessing, you know, that your growing season's not very long, or, you know, it's tough. Like Flagstaff, we're tough. We're at 7,000 feet. You know, we're still experiencing freezing temperatures at night. So like, what's your favorite thing to grow?
Oh man. Yeah. We, today when we're recording this, the temperatures had just plunged back to freezing in Milwaukee after we had gotten some things ready. So we're hoping everything's going to be okay, but it's kind of erratic in the spring here. Yeah, and our growing zone is probably totally different than yours, but in the sense of we have to plant later, it's a lot smaller amount of time. You know, we try to grow pretty much anything we can. One of our hopefully will be a big crop this year is just a ton of lettuce and kale. My wife is vegan, so kale is like her go-to for pretty much anything that we're having.
Yep.
And then tomatoes. Tomatoes are just fantastic. We've gotten some wonderful heirloom tomato plants through seeds, but also from some friends. So being able to grow those sort of things. And I just peeked at the garden yesterday afternoon, and our onions are already like we could probably cut some things off of those and get those ready to go right now because they've been in the ground for a long time. But yeah, we love growing everything. We put some flowers in and along them as well so that we can get our pollinators
Yep.
alongside of the gardens. It's just a ton of fun.
I appreciate it. And so you love gardening, but you've also then pastored for decades, both as, in large established churches, but I think if I remember
Mhm.
correctly, you've been a church planter.
Yep.
And so what stirred in you that caused you to think we needed a different metaphor to think about what it means to be a pastor?
Yeah, there was a few different kind of crisis moments for me, Andrew, that kind of led me into some conversation around this. Some of it was the pandemic time really was destabilizing for everybody, not just pastors, but for everybody. In a
Yeah.
specific way for pastors, what was the church about? What did it mean to be doing ministry? What was it going to look like? And then for us as a multiracial church, in the wake of the pandemic, there was a big national awareness, I would say, and conversation and some tension, obviously, around racial justice issues, things that were already very much a part of our lives, but maybe just kind of brought out to the surface around George Floyd and things like that. So I was asking some significant questions about what it meant to be the church, what was public witness. Through that, had some tensions in our church that caused difficulty. And then also had a dear friend who went through a major moral failure as a pastor. And I just started asking questions about the way that pastors were being formed and nurtured in what they were doing. And as I was searching around, reading a ton, found myself going back to scripture and entering into the doorway of agrarian imagery through Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5, I planted, Apollos watered, but God is the one who gives the growth. And I think I had heard of that always as a church planting scripture passage. And I realized that was not what Paul was talking about there. And it just opened up for me some things in my imagination that then took me from Genesis through Revelation, just searching out the agrarian imagery, the agricultural imagery in a new way. And that just kind of, I don't know how else to describe it. I don't want to be too dramatic about it, but it really just set my imagination afire. And helped me think about ministry through those images as I got in touch with the way God talks about Israel as a planting of the Lord, as Jesus is the vine and the branches, but also there's some gardening imagery connected to Jesus at the end of the Gospel of John that became very rich for me. So all of that, I think, really helped me in a time of crisis gain some new vitality for how I was thinking about ministry, but also I think just even my own discipleship life too.
Say more about the discipleship aspect, because your book is The Pastor as Gardener, and so many of my listeners aren't pastors, and so they're like, okay, why should I stay listening if
Yeah.
and so I'm curious, like for your own, like in your own soul, like how has this image cultivated a deeper love for Jesus?
Yeah. I mean, I hope, and I'll just say this to the side, Andrew, I don't know if this is going to see the light of day, but I am working on kind of an approach to some of this that it's more accessible, almost thinking of it as like a Henry Nouwen spiritual life type of book around spirituality that's connected to these agrarian images. We'll see if that happens or not. But for me, it's really helped me think a lot about certain concepts that have become powerful for me. To think of Jesus saying, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it's only a grain of wheat. But if it does go into the earth and it becomes many seeds, that's become very evocative for me for thinking about the spiritual life. What does it mean to die? What does it mean to go into the soil? What does it mean to let God do hidden things in our lives that we may not see for a long time, maybe even for years or decades that he's doing? How can we trust God with those sorts of things? What does it mean that nothing in our lives is wasted, but actually even things that seem like they're dying in our lives or our spiritual life become compost in which the next growth happens? That's really helped me because I think I've experienced things where I've experienced failure or grief, and to just see those through the lens of compost has actually been very healing for me. And to feel like, okay, I don't have to just view this as a negative. It is painful, but there's something good here. Images of the pruning that happens Jesus says that God, as the gardener in John 15, that he also prunes branches, and that's grace. There's a grace in that of God's pruning work. That's helped me think about discipline in a different way, or suffering in a different way. And then even the fruitfulness, there's things in our spiritual life that we want to nurture to growth. We can do certain things, and this is true for the pastoral side of it too. But there's a lot of things that we just don't have control over, but God is still doing something in our lives, and he can bring fruitfulness even where we might not expect it. And I think also the imagery of sowing seeds in the spiritual life into the lives of other people, pouring into others, that no plant exists kind of as an end to itself, but is actually intended to kind of carry something out into a future generation or future progeny, in a sense. I think that makes me think about spiritual children and the way that we pour into people's lives. There's a lot there for me that's been it's like my imagination just got opened up, and it's really so much fun.
It's fun when something catches the imagination, whether it's a Bible verse or an author's quote that just helps you see scripture in new ways, that unlock something. Like you see that was always there, but you never noticed it as in depth. It's always, it's like when you're looking for the car and you're thinking about buying a Nissan Altima, all of a sudden everyone's driving a Nissan Altima.
You see it everywhere.
And so I think, how you described the garden and these ideas is similar to me, and how I started seeing food everywhere play out in scripture. And so it's fun to see you become enlivened as you talk about it, because I resonate deeply with that journey. But we also find ourselves, sort of at this micro level in the culture. And you write early on that culturally we're a culture without memory, uprooted from place, and lost in a swirling ocean of technological distraction and disembodied existence. That's a mouthful, and but I think it, if we're honest, we're like, okay, that resonates. So like, can you unpack that a little? And then I'd love to hear how the garden might then come into play with these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all feel that something isn't right. And what is it that isn't right? It's not one thing, it's multiple things, but I mean, definitely the disembodied existence. I mean, I love the fact that you and I are having this conversation right now through technological means, and we're going to share that with other people. I think that's a gift. And at the same time, the way that this has almost become default, especially post-pandemic, for meetings, for conversations with people. I just mentioned I just did a premarital counseling with my wife, and all 4 of the people involved in that were all in different places on a Zoom call. And it helps us, but also there is kind of this sense that we can be anywhere, we can do anything, and it doesn't have a cost. And I think we're actually carrying the cost inside of ourselves, in our minds, in our mental health. And then the disconnection from the natural world, which we are called in Genesis 1 to be having cultivation for, development, caretaking, stewardship. Our disconnection from that, I think, is actually damaging to ourselves as people. And also the rootlessness in relation to physical places. You're in Flagstaff, I'm in Milwaukee. These are very different places from each other.
Yep.
And that's significant. And I think we don't pay attention to that, the increasing way we just get enmeshed and subsumed into technology and online life sometimes disconnects us from the significance of our place and region and the geography, and even how that plays out in generational living and things like that. So I'm trying to say, in the spiritual life, place is important. Our geography is important. The way that shapes our lives is important. A connection to the created world is important. And in ministry, I'm using some of that in a metaphorical sense to help us unpack environment, context, soil, things like that in relation to the ministry world. But that's true of spiritual life in general too.
As we think about community context, whether that's, a small group we're part of, or a church we're part of, or like what does the garden provide us that can help us then keep us attuned to the specificity of our own life. Because like you said, Milwaukee is different than Flagstaff. And so like, how does the garden shape us so that we then might be more faithful um, disciples of Jesus?
Yeah. So I would say that I talk a lot about soil as kind of the place in which we
Mhm.
do ministry. But for those who are not in pastoral ministry, some other form of ministry, you could just refer this to the sense in which the place where you're living your disciple life with
Yeah.
Christ, your spiritual formation location. And so, the attentiveness to the physical place. I'll just talk about Milwaukee a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm not a Milwaukee native. I grew up in the Mississippi River Valley of Western Illinois, but I've lived in Milwaukee since 2003. And I feel like, the last 20 some years have been an education in this space, this place. Milwaukee, I don't know what reputation it has to other people, but it's actually a wonderful city in so many ways. Close to Lake Michigan, urban, but not so big that you can't get around. Um, it's got a wonderful diversity to it in so many ways in the city, even though the state of Wisconsin isn't as diverse. But it also has some challenging things. It's been on some of the top 10 lists of difficult things, educational disparities. The book Evicted by Matthew Desmond it takes place in Milwaukee. All of his studies are from Milwaukee. And so there's economic disparities, and it's often listed as one of the most segregated cities in the United States because of the way it was settled in the Great Migration, and before and afterwards. So being aware of how that impacts my city, the way that I do ministry as a pastor, what I need to pay attention to, the secret stories that are underneath the ground that shape people's lives, I think that's really, really important. That's one way that I think about the soil of the spiritual life or ministry. And then I also think about it in terms of the story of my church. I think about it in terms of a church's story. Sometimes pastors will come into a church or will enter into a church space or kind of a religious space, and we'll just think in kind of non-specific terms. We just need to plug in this program or this model. And it's so important to pay attention to the history, the culture, the personality of a specific church or community. And then also if it's part of a larger denomination or just even thinking through the North American realities, church in decline, things like
Yeah.
that. So I just think the soil in terms of the locality, region, geography, and then also soil in terms of the specific church or community really, really shapes us more than we realize. And sometimes we just don't pay attention to it as much now.
You mean we're not attuned to soil? Like we don't like to think about soil? Like,
Yeah.
and so, but soil there's such richness and beauty,
Mhm.
and you reference Matthew Evans' work Soil in your book, and I picked it up to start reading because I'm intrigued by soil because I
Yeah.
sell wine and, and I love thinking about soil. Like, what did you learn about soil as in your research that sort of transformed how you thought about soil versus just say dirt?
Yeah. Wow. That's a huge discussion, actually.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that you asked that question. And I'm not a soil expert by any means, right?
Right.
I'm a pastor, but I think the things that I caught along the way, I mean, Wendell Berry talks a lot about soil erosion
Mhm.
in his writings. And so Barry is, I know, someone we both admire and appreciate so much. But when you think about the physical aspects of how soil is going away and you're losing nutrients, it's getting washed into our rivers and down into the oceans, and we're losing some of those things, it actually connects for me with then how we live our life out. And so if we're living a rootless way, we are actually oftentimes contributing to the erosion, in a sense, of the vitality and the nutrition of spaces. There is something about being in a place for a long time. So roots help soil stay in space. I've been at my church now for 15 years, almost 16. I've been in Milwaukee since 2003 in 3 different church settings. And I've been here. I didn't expect I was going to be here this long. to be honest. I think when I came into my first role that brought me up to work with university students, I thought, I didn't think of it in terms of a stepping stone, but I think that if I'm honest, that might have been a mindset that I had. But I've just chosen, for this season of time now, 23 years, to be in this space, learn this space, and let it shape me. And I think that's done good things to me, and maybe some painful things.
Yeah.
But I think it's also enabled me to be a more rooted person, even in my congregation and in my community. So I think that's one aspect of it. And I think also, you're talking about that book on soil. He talks, and I use one quote in that, you probably remember reading it, might be how you found it, but he talks about how the food that you eat tastes like the soil in which it was grown.
Yeah.
And also reflects in some ways the way that someone cared, like a farmer cared for that soil. Wow. To think about the personality or the life of a farmer going into the soil to actually then be reflected in the food. Again, very imaginatively evocative for me about how we live our spiritual lives or how we do ministry, that it really does. It's like we're pouring our lives into that. And somebody who cares for soil, we were just remediating our soil, getting ready our raised beds, putting compost in it, putting manure in it, helping it get ready. It needs things. And so it takes time to do the unsexy work of caring for soil. It takes effort and attention, but I don't want to say it bears dividends. I don't want to use monetized terms for that. It really, though, does bring fruitfulness when we pay attention to those things. So I think that's another thing that maybe stood out to me. I'd love to hear your thoughts upon it, Andrew, because you probably thought about it more than I have even.
I don't know. Yeah. No, because soil is beautiful. And like you said, it brings forth something different, because it's easy just to use, as we think about gardening. We're recording this in mid-April. People across the country are probably thinking about gardens at this point, right? It's the season. Right. And it's easy to use processed fertilizers, go to a big store to get, seedlings already there, and so it's easy to do that, probably more so than it is to compost, to enrich the soil in a way that is healthy, that can actually be regenerative and generational for who we are. And so it's a lot harder work than a capitalized way of doing it. But what brings forth is way more beautiful. Like we were talking about heirloom tomatoes. And when you taste an heirloom tomato that is nurtured and grown with care and respect and nurture, like it is a beautiful piece of work of art, versus a hothouse tomato that you pick up from a Kroger grocery store in December. And so you should be able to taste the difference, but it's harder work. And that's, I think, many times, whether individually, as we think about our spiritual lives, or communally as pastors, being a former pastor, it's like, okay, we got to keep up with the results. We got to get more of this. We got to do more of this. And, it's Andy Root's work of accumulation and driven by this desire for more that we get caught up in, and we lose sight of the slower, more beautiful work of cultivating something that will last.
Yeah. I love that word slower that you mentioned. We both, we talked about slow church, just briefly mentioned it before we started our call here. And that slowness is so against the grain in our day and time. And I think if we're honest, at least I'll be honest, I'd prefer to be fast. It just like, I think everything in our culture kind of has trained me, at least, to be that way. And it is hard to slow down. It's hard to give time for things. But when you talk about soil, you're not thinking about this season. You are, but you're thinking about next season. You're thinking about 5 years from now. And even the work of compost, it's all about what's coming in the future. It's really not for the present moment. And so it does take this slow attentiveness, a different pacing, which I think we all desire, but so hard to get out of the fast pace.
For sure. And I think it's how to do it in incremental ways too, that are, not jarring.
Yeah.
because it's like, it's one thing, okay, I'm tired of the rat race, I'm tired of the speed. Like, you can't just unplug, and you can't just lead people to unplug. And so it's like, how do you do that incremental work, to do it? And again, it goes back to gardening. Like, your garden's not going to become healthy in one season. So that's again, like, how do we slowly nurture a raised bed in our backyards
Yeah.
that, the soil is living and teeming with more life than we can ever imagine or see.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Yeah,
yeah, like
absolutely.
it, it's beautiful. And yet, like, I think many of us think, okay, I want to slow down. I want to cultivate a beautiful soil, but I don't know how, or like, what's a step, And so, like,
Mm-hmm.
as you've thought about that, as you've led your church, for a decade and a half, like, how do you help people then start maybe looking at a different way, or raising an imagination, cultivating an imagination? Um,
Hmm. Yeah, I would say one thing that I would answer, and I feel like it could sound trite, but I don't mean it that way, is prayer.
hmm,
And what I mean by prayer is to give ourselves space for the slowing of prayer. One thing that we've just started to put into place for our staff in the last, I don't know, year and a half maybe, is we do sort of a midday Wednesday prayer gathering, and it tends to be pretty contemplative, meditative, and it's only 30 minutes. It's not some fancy thing. We're not conquering the world. We're not trying to. We're just trying to get ourselves back into remembering that as we do ministry work, we're also just disciples. And so I
hmm,
think that has almost become a slowing moment for our staff team in the middle of the week. And um, I think that can be really healing. I have friends who will do, like the different hours of prayer during the course of a day. And again, they're not necessarily pausing for an hour and a half. It might be 10 minutes.
right.
And it's really just to help us in that place be attentive to God, sometimes just attentive to ourselves, what's happening in ourselves, and attentive to our day so that we don't get caught up in the frenetic rhythms of everything that's going on. So that's just one thing that I think I might
Hmm,
say. And another thing that sounds, again, it feels simple. I talk a lot in the book at different places about attention
hmm,
and the importance of attention in our spiritual lives, in ministry. And I think we all know right now that in the attention economy, that we are being trained away from being attentive. And I think in a necessary part of that is we sell our attention off to the lowest bidder. We are also losing our ability to be aware of our own pace. And so I would, I'm not a Luddite, but I would say being attentive to the way that we're giving our attention away, which sounds
hmm,
funny, being attentive to the amount of time we're spending online or with our smartphones. Just again, I'm not an anti-technology person. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here with you.
right.
But I just believe it requires a tremendous amount of stewardship of our mental space, our
Hmm.
heart space, and that helps us slow down just by being aware of that. There's a couple things I would say at a practical level. I don't know if that sounded practical.
But it is, because I think attention is, like you said, everything is screaming for our attention, and
Mm-hmm.
as we think even about how to be faithful in this time, like, the news grabs our attention, and every issue requires a response from us,
Yeah.
or and so, like, but I think the beauty of a garden is my attention, yes, I need to pay attention to the world events, but how do I pay attention to Flagstaff events?
Yeah.
For me personally, how do you pay attention to Milwaukee events? Like,
Mm-hmm.
my daughter gave a presentation, to tell a story, like, gave a presentation to the school board recently about, like, her robotics team. And it was great, fourth grader being able to speak to the school board and share highlights. It's
Mm-hmm.
super cool. But I was able to sit through public comments. And Arizona education is is a mess at times, and Flagstaff is dealing with some major issues. But it really helped me to sit through that. I was like, oh, this was actually really beneficial because it directly impacts, my kids. It impacts me. It impacts my community, and how do we get good teachers and increase pay, and there's cuts. Like it's a mess, but to sit through it helped me understand more local issues versus, just paying attention to Iran, which again requires attention, but also so does my local government.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be both and with that.
Yeah.
But oftentimes the global or the headlines in the national scene sort of overtake everything else, and we miss out on some of the things happening down the street.
Yeah. And I think too, you had this great quote that I think ties into the attention aspect. It's from Wendell Berry about like the difference between an exploiter and a nurturer. Where you quote, where Wendell says, the standard of the exploiter is efficiency. The standard of the nurturer is care. The exploiter's goal is money, profit. The nurturer's goal is health, his land's health, his own, his family's, his communities, his countries. And so I think as we pay attention, I think nurture, developing a nurturing stance and posture will only help.
Yeah, I mean, Wendell Berry is such an amazing prophet, and also a voice for deep care. I mean, soul care, whatever language you want to put on some of this. I mean, that quote and some other things have just really been extraordinarily helpful for me. I ask myself, am I a pastor who's an exploiter, or am I a nurturer? Every pastor wants to say we're nurturing, and yet there are ways that sometimes we might be not providing really true care. And what does that look like? How do we, if we have to measure things, how do we determine that? Is it just certain people within our congregation? Is it the whole congregation? Is it the community around the congregation? All of those things are so important. And yeah, just the attentiveness that enables you to provide care is key to that.
And so, yeah, because all of us would say, none of us, I'm not an exploiter. I'm a, but there may be, right, because the language is jarring, and Wendell is very purposeful with his language, so he doesn't choose that word lightly,
right?
But it would be easy to be like, well, I'm not exploiting. But are there more subtle ways that maybe that mindset, an exploitation mindset, shows up in church or in life that we need to be aware of? That, like, again, maybe we're not full on exploiters that are like destroying the earth, but what are some ways that maybe exploitation shows up that are less than, are more subtle?
Yeah, I think that sometimes, when we talking about church, church can be present in a community, almost taking up space, but maybe not pouring back into the community. A lot of people, when they talk about compost, what you're talking about is not letting anything that you've taken from the earth not somehow make its way back to the earth in a meaningful way. And so if we think about the church exploiting a neighborhood, such strong language, but if we're really nurturing a neighborhood, it's going to look different. And I'm going to be honest, like, our church is not perfect. I'm not saying Eastbrook is perfect, for sure. Anybody who knows us and the challenges of the neighborhood where we're at, there's huge needs. And yet, one thing that's coming up this coming weekend, there's like a citywide initiative that's part of something called Milwaukee River Keepers. There's a Milwaukee River that runs through our city out into Lake Michigan, and it needs help. So there's some folks, it's not a Christian initiative, but we've joined in with that for years on that Saturday to on our part of the river. It runs right behind our campus, to help provide care with the community that's gathered here. So that we're not just pulling resources out of the place or just taking up space, but not somehow putting something back in. How do we be for the good of the neighborhood, the good of the city? And that can be an abstract slogan, but it gets real when you're saying, actually, the square footage right behind our south parking lot where the river, one of the tributaries runs, we're going to be in charge of trying to take care of that so that both on our side and then the other side, which abuts one of the city parks called Moe Park, like that is cared for. And it's not
Mhm.
just us, but we're actually also trying to nurture community and be part of it. We're not leading that. We're just coming inside of something. So those are, I think, like, that's again a practical way to be
Yeah.
attentive to it. We are a church that has people from the city. We're in the city, but also from the suburbs. So how do we make sure that we're just not a destination and people aren't somehow invested in the space? We've done some different things with it. We have a host a neighborhood health clinic. It's part of a citywide 3 locations. We're one of those locations. Again, we didn't create this, but we're hosting it. And we have volunteers who serve there. And so some of those ways of like, it's an old phrase that people can kind of use in utilitarian ways, but if the church ceased to exist, would the neighborhood care?
Right.
And hopefully the answer would be yes. In
Yeah.
our case, we want it to be that, but we have ways to grow for sure.
But then too, to realize the beauty of a garden is what works for your church at Eastbrook won't work for Flagstaff. And so we can't copy
Right.
and paste. We can learn. I think there's principles, there's transferable ideas that, like we can be in dialogue together to help. Again, I keep using the word cultivate, which,
It's
as we
great.
talked about garden, like, but we can be in conversation to help cultivate imaginations across states, but we
Yeah.
can't, it's not a one size fits all,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah, I love that phrase, cultivate imagination across states. Like I can learn from you, you can learn from me, but it's not going to be a plug and play.
Mhm.
There might even be some similarities, but we have to know our place.
Yeah. And so much of recent church history, maybe, and, tied to the church growth movement has wanted, to provide models that can quickly grow a church.
Mhm.
Whereas again, if we're gardeners, it's going to take a longer time that won't be as easy. And one thing you do that I loved is, you talked about the seasons,
Yeah.
and so, because we're, there's different ways to think of growth, and you outline those, and but you come back to these ideas of seasons, both individually and communally. I found that really helpful. And so, can you, as we think about gardening, like how do seasons come into play metaphorically for us, both
Mhm.
maybe individually and communally?
Yeah. A lot of the work that I explored initially in the chapter about seasons is looking at sort of stages of spiritual growth, right? Like
Mhm.
Fowler has his stages of growth. So that's more linear. I'm a huge fan of the book, The Critical Journey, which talks about these stages of spiritual growth and a wall you might run into. That was really helpful for me as a
Yeah.
framework for the linear growth. But I think what can sometimes be missed is that cyclical growth of seasons. And so I try to explore that. And I think I'm still kind of intuiting my way to what that means. But I do think that when we think about communities or even our own spiritual life, there are times where we will go through what can be a springtime where it feels like there's just vibrancy of growth. You're seeing things pop out. This is what's happening in Milwaukee right now. The spring flowers are coming up, the tulips, the daffodils. You can see the very edges of the buds coming off the trees. And so springtime is a time of attentiveness and wonder at everything just growing. So we can experience that where there might be some new initiative happening in a church or we're sensing some momentum around something. I'm not even sure I love that word, but I'll just use it anyway.
Yeah.
Or in our spiritual life where we may see something new kind of coming forth. It's emerging. We don't know how to name it yet sometimes. Summer are the times where it's like very vibrant and it just feels like the birds are flying, the butterflies are coming through, the crops are coming up in a sense. So you're seeing a lot of growth. Churches may be in times where they see just a lot of growth, and that can be a wonderful time. It also can be an overwhelming time. In our spiritual life, there may be season we'd say like, "Oh, this is a summertime. It just felt vibrant and alive." Sometimes those are the times when people says, "Hey, what was a great time of your spiritual life? When were you closest to God?" Those are
Yeah.
probably the times we point to. And then the fall and the autumn becomes a season where there are things that start to die off. And obviously, when we talk about this in terms of a church or our spiritual life, we recognize there are things where we might be letting go of different ways of thinking about the spiritual life or thinking about God. We might be having to let go of old patterns of our life, dying to sin and coming alive in some newness of life and abundant life. I don't know. But in the church, when we talk about a community going through an autumn, this gets hard because we kind of like to have everything always growing. We want it to be perpetual summer.
Yep.
And I think as a pastor, we're as guilty of this as anybody else. But I do think it's helpful to recognize there are seasons for things to die.
Yeah.
Whether it's a ministry, whether it's an end to a group, a small group, or some other thing, it's okay. It's okay. And in fact, when we resist that, sometimes we're working against God. And so recognizing some of that and embracing the end of things is also good. Learning how to bring a good end. And then that there are winter times. There are times where we go through, I think spiritually, we might equate this with something like a dark night of the soul or a spiritual desert, times where we don't see any growth happening. But in some senses, we have to entrust ourselves to God and believe there are things happening below the surface that we may not even know. And I think there's also ways that the church can go through it. Individual church, or even in North America, I kind of feel like we are in a winter. Yeah. It's a subterranean time. It feels confusing. It feels barren. It can feel like a decline or retraction. And certainly sometimes churches will actually die, fully go, and it's the end of their season. But at other times, it might just be a season a church goes through that might be kind of a realignment time or a reframing, a reimagining of what the church could be. I don't know. I think it's really suggestive. I'm still kind of trying to figure out my way through it, Andrew.
I appreciate that, just because I think, like you said, we want spring and summer, and we cling to it with white-knuckled fists, you know, and we want to keep it going, you know, like the momentum word. It's not a great word, but it's a word that, you know, we want to keep that momentum going, you know, like we see thousands of people come on Easter and we think the next week, if those people all don't return, we've done something wrong, you know, like,
right.
You know, but to think, like you said, like, okay, if the church in North America might be in this time of winter, in this dormancy or hibernation, might be too strong of a word, but maybe it's a time of just thinking and reflecting, and like to try to force spring and summer into winter wouldn't work. Like you and I would never plant a garden in winter because everything's frozen. Like, you know,
right.
And, you know, and yet we try that with church or spiritual life. And so the wisdom of how to then approach that, because it does feel bewildering. It feels confusing. We don't know what to do in those seasons, both, I think, at an individual level and at a communal level. And so how do we then, again, enter into dialogue with others to help, okay, like I'm feeling this, like how, what might Jesus be calling me into, or what might Jesus be calling us as a community into, and how do we settle versus fight? It's so hard.
Yeah. I think there's some of that is even, you know, part of what I just hear you saying is, you know, you need people in your life, whether you're talking about your spiritual life, whether those are kind of spiritual friends or a spiritual director who you can process this stuff with. And then I think also for church communities, a lot of times, whether we talk about, you know, elders or church council or consistory, vestry, whatever leadership structures are there, a lot of times we're afraid to actually talk about that stuff. Hey, I feel like this thing is maybe not what we're supposed to be about anymore. And there's a lot of risk in that. But I think you can trust the good gardener, our God who is the good gardener, it says in John 15. So how do we enter into discerning together what he's doing and not move out of fear or avoidance, but embracing some of these things? Like, actually, God might be doing this. He might be taking us into a winter. And what might that mean? And how do we pay attention to that? How do we accept it instead of fight against it? It's just a different posture. I'm not talking about passivity, just letting whatever happens to us, but actually actively embracing some of these seasons. And sometimes there are multiple seasons happening in a church in different areas of ministry at the same time.
Right. You know, and then, you know, pastors, elders, there's budgets, giving has, and so that's
Yes.
the risk of this embracing of a winter. Is if we embrace winter, what does that mean,
Mhm.
fiscally, which, like, again, you never want to operate from that posture fully, but it's there. And to not at least voice that the fiscal responsibility a church and elders have, which is a huge weight,
Mhm.
like what does that mean? I think that's where it gets scary for churches, because pastors' livelihoods are dependent on certain aspects,
Yes.
and so it is scary. But how to do it in a way that brings forth greater health, down the
Mhm.
road, is hard. And you end your book with a chapter on hope, which I think is important,
Yeah.
because it's easy to say, okay, if we're in winter, doom and gloom, but why do we need to steward hope in this
Yeah.
season?
There's so many things that could make us lose hope right now,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Our national conversation is just so conflicted, regardless of where you land politically. I think there's a lot of hopelessness.
Hmm.
You look at the world situation, global conflicts that seem to just carry on, and the sense of angst that so many people have around the world. And then things in our own neighborhoods and cities. Again, I can only speak to Milwaukee and some of the challenges we were dealing with. You talked about education. We have some challenges with that in our own city. Again, dollars are pulled tighter, so even public services are being
Hmm.
challenged in our city. So I think with all that happening, and then people saying things like the church is in decline in North America, it is really easy to fall into hopelessness.
Yeah.
Um, but the gospel is a message that is full of hope. It's not a false hope, and it's not a false optimism.
Mm.
And I think the key to that is remembering the story of Jesus, that he's the bringer of hope, but he went into death.
Yeah.
And if Jesus walked inside of death and walked out the other side, I don't want to be simplistic, and the resurrection happened, then we have to be people of hope, even if it goes against what we perceive. And
Mm.
so I do think there's sort of this hope that's linked to the resurrection, Jesus' resurrection, and then a sort of an eschatological hope that's linked with the consummation of all things, the new heaven
Yeah.
and the new earth, that we are living now as sort of fully engaged with the resurrection of Jesus. We're living now fully engaged with the new heaven and the new earth. We're trying to model, or I don't want to say model, I want to image forth that reality now.
Mm.
And even in dark times, we have an opportunity to do that. It's not easy, but we have that kind of. I think of Ephesians 1. It says you have an inheritance, like a deposit in your life
Yeah.
by the Spirit's presence now. And so I think that hope ties in within the way we live. We keep sowing seeds. We keep cultivating our lives. We cultivate the land of ministry, our church, our communities in a meaningful way as image bearers, and as image bearers of the resurrection. And a gardener is, if anything, a person of hope, putting things into the ground, hoping
Yep.
that something's going to come up,
Yeah.
just like we started the beginning of our conversation, like you don't know. And
Right.
so I think it's an image of hope.
Mm.
I just say, like, the hope is the kind of the defining virtue of the pastor gardener. But I think I'm not trying to say it's more important than love. I mean, Paul said the greatest of these is love, so I don't want to argue with him.
No.
But it's powerful. It's so important to have that theological virtue in our lives.
I just finished reading, and I'm late to the party on it, but just finished Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination.
Mm,
Um, and
amazing book.
but his sort of twofold task of the prophet, of cultivating grief, but also then hope, or
Hmm.
the energizing message of Isaiah is where he draws it from, and then ties it to Jesus too. But where, we got to give voice to the grief of what we're losing, but then also continue to paint and steward and paint a picture of a new world, that is coming and is here. And so, as I was thinking about hope, it's where, since it was fresh in my mind, of like, how do we hold those two in tension of, stewarding our people through grief, but also then helping them see that grief is not the end. Like, Good
Hmm.
Friday, Saturday isn't the end of the story, but there is resurrection, and newness
Yeah.
that will come again.
Yeah, there's
No.
nothing like winter in Milwaukee when the first daffodils, crocuses, and tulips start to come up.
Yeah.
It's like something happens in our city and you can just feel like joy humming in the air. And I feel like part of what the calling of the Jesus follower is in these days is, if I can borrow a phrase from N.T. Wright, he once said, it's like, what should you do? Plant a tree. And he meant that both maybe literally, you're kind of imaging forth new creation in a literal way, but also spiritually.
Yeah.
You're doing something that speaks of hope, and in some ways we have been filled with hope by God, but we also cultivate hope by doing things that are connected to the kingdom, connected to life. Let the joy hum in the air as we plant sort of the spiritual tulips and real tulips in the midst of our cities, in our neighborhoods, in our world. There's something profound about both at the same time, the literal and the metaphorical.
There is something, because every spring and every, when, we have some fruit trees in our yards too, which is fun. And,
That's cool.
we plant and we do the same thing, and I can do the exact same thing each and every year and I will get radically different results. But the hope is still there. And so it's that, okay, I will be responsible, but I cannot ultimately control my garden.
Right. Right.
There are forces beyond my control. We could have a late frost that ruins everything again, And so I think,
Yes.
like that, as we work and plant, literally, I think it does help me maybe hold less tightly to control, because I realize I can be faithful, but I Jesus calls the growth to
Yeah,
bring it
absolutely.
back full circle to Corinthians.
Yeah, and for me, that's been one of the most freeing things of this whole journey about the pastor as a gardener is I can know what I have control over. Like I have control over certain things,
Yep.
but a lot of it I don't. And that's just taken some pressure off of me as a pastor. Again, it doesn't mean I'm not working hard. Doesn't mean I'm
Yep.
just like, oh, God's just going to do it all. I'm doing a lot, but I know that I can't make that happen. And so it's freed me from trying to be God. That's been great.
No, it is. Yeah. It's a tough lesson as pastors to learn that we're not in control. But I think when we can embrace it, even if we're not pastors, it is freeing.
Yeah. And even for all of us as we follow Jesus, there are people in our lives, there are situations in our lives that we want to be in control over. And we, in a sense, have to let that go and entrust that to God, who is a good nurturer and does provide nurturing care into our lives. That's really powerful for me.
Yeah. I feel like there's a whole book on parenting as a garden, that you could.
Yeah. It's actually pretty funny. I have a friend who's not a pastor, and he sent me a text after finishing my book, and he said it was like 5 different titles of other books that could be offshoots of it, and one of them was he's like The Parent as a Gardener. I was like, good point, and I think what he was just trying to say as someone who's not a pastor, he really resonated with the book and applied it to his own work life, but in different spheres of his life. And I hadn't really thought about it that way because I was living out of the pastoring role. I was talking to a nonprofit leader who had the same thing. He's like, oh, this has been so helpful for me in leading this nonprofit that I'm a part of. And it's very, very encouraging.
That is cool. And so it's a question I ask all of my guests as we begin to wrap up. What's the story you want the church to tell?
I want the church to tell the story of a Jesus who has redeemed all of life and all of creation. And he is sowing seeds of good news and hope. And I want us to tell a story of a community of people from every tribe and tongue and nation who get to gather around the throne of God. And there are no second-class citizens. And if I can borrow from your title, there's a big table. And everybody's welcome to gather around King Jesus's table, and it's a beautiful place. So I'm not sure if that's a story, but it feels like one to me.
No, it's beautiful. Appreciate it. And some fun questions about food. What's one food you refuse to eat?
This is going to sound so bad as we just talked about gardening.
Yeah.
I just do not like eggplant. I've tried so hard. So
Okay.
I'm pretty much a no eggplant person, even though I really wish I could like it.
Okay. That's fair.
If somebody has a great recipe, please send it my way. I could use it.
Have you done the Asian style eggplant dishes, or there's Chinese eggplants and there's obviously the Italian eggplant dishes, but
Yeah,
so
I
I'm
have
just
had
curious.
some. I have had some more on the Asian side through our good friends who are Chinese, and
Okay.
I'm not convinced yet.
Okay.
It's not convinced me.
All right. On the other end of the spectrum, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
Oh man. Oh, I think sometimes the best foods are also the best experiences of being at a table. And I was with some dear friends in the Middle East gathered around the table with their family.
Mm.
And they just kept bringing out dish after
Mm.
dish of wonderful homemade food.
Yeah.
I already love kind of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern food, but to have it coming out of their kitchen and to enjoy the conversation with people I've known for a long time and new family members that I hadn't met before, the whole atmosphere and the food together was just an amazing experience for me.
That's beautiful. And finally, there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you only had one more meal left to enjoy, what would it be? So if Matt had one last meal, what might be on the table?
Oh, wow. If I had one last meal and I could pick anything, this is going to sound so simple. I would probably just have an amazing dish of spaghetti with homemade meatballs and some really amazing salad. I won't determine what that would be. And like a glass of red wine and good community to be with. That would be satisfactory to me.
Awesome. Well, Matt, really appreciate it. This conversation. Love your work, your heart. If people are interested in learning more about you and your work, where might they find you?
Yeah, easiest place probably to find me is my website, which is mwerickson.com. And then also I write on Substack, and it's mwerickson.substack.com. And you can find that there, and also take a peek at The Pastor as Gardener, all the places people look at books.
Yep. It's published by Erdmond. But yeah, even if you're not a pastor, I think like Matt was saying towards the end, there's rich depth to be procured from the book. So yeah, highly encourage it. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.